Hello and welcome. I'm Zeinab Badawi, and it's my pleasure to be in conversation with the President of the British Academy in his last event in this post, because he leaves at the end of this week. My great friend, Professor Sir David Cannadine, who's been President of the British Academy since 2017. Now, David, as most of you know, of course, is one of the country's, indeed the world's, pre-eminent historians. He's written so many books about, all sorts of characters: G.M. Trevelyan, Andrew Mellon, Margaret Thatcher, King George V. I could go on and on. And he's currently a Dodge Professor of History at Princeton University in the United States, but still keeps his hand in here with the UK because he's visiting Professor of History at Oxford University. And alongside his distinguished career, David has served as a trustee of many of our great institutions here in the UK. I've had the pleasure of joining him on some of these boards. He was chair of the National Portrait Gallery. He is chair of the Blue Plaques panel. He's been on the board of Historic Royal Palaces, a member of numerous committees, really, the Royal Mint Advisory Committee. I could go on and on. So really, David is a fully paid up member of the great and the good here in the UK. And it's my great pleasure to be in conversation with him. We'll talk for about 45 minutes. And then there's an opportunity for you also to put some questions to David, and I will do my best to get around as many as I can. So do just use the Q&A function and just put down your questions as you're hearing what David has to say. So David, please join me on the virtual stage, and it's terrific to see you, David. Very sunny here in London, so I hope it's good where you are. And David, I should say this to you, and I will say it now, that I really feel terribly privileged to have known you for I think it's more than 20 years now, isn't it?
I think it is, yes. Well, it's lovely to see you, Zeinab, and we are indeed old friends, and we met in circumstances that would be slightly implausible were they not true. That's to say, we met in a stretch limousine making the journey from the airport to the centre of Prague in September 2000. And I remember that primarily because it is the first occasion we met, but I also remember it because it was my 50th birthday, so that's quite a long time ago now. But we have indeed known each other since then, and it's very good of you to be willing to converse in front of, I hope, a reasonable number of people on this particular occasion, and I'm, of course, delighted to be with you.
So a lot to talk to you about, because I want you really to, give us your reflections on your life and your career as a historian, but also as a member of the institutions I was mentioning. And also really, in a sense, David, to discuss the place of history in our national life today, particularly in the era of COVID and Brexit. But let's go back to the beginning. How did you get to where you are now, this distinguished career as a historian? Was it quite unexpected or not? Because I know that there was a key person, a really passionate school teacher of history who inspired in you as a schoolboy in Birmingham, this passion for the subject. Was it a revelation, or was it something that you'd been interested in as a very young child?
Well, it's certainly true that the life that I've been lucky enough to lead is certainly not the one that I might realistically have supposed to have expected. And it's also true that since the guiding activity, I suppose, of my life has been the study of history, researching history, writing history, and all the other things have kind of flowed from that, that becoming a kind of devotee of Clio has turned out to be rather important. And it's certainly true that one of the ways that happened, I think the most important way, was that I did have a very inspiring history teacher. And interestingly, when I was once talking to Andrew Motion, and we got to discussing how he'd ended up with a life in literature and poetry and how I'd ended up with a life writing history. And we both had the same answer. It was an inspired schoolmaster, in my case, a man called Graham Butler, who taught me at my grammar school. And he was a remarkable figure, and I loved reading history. I loved writing about it for him. And I'm not sure that I ever, in a sense, thought of wanting to be doing anything else. I applied to university to read history, which is what I did. And as it were, the rest is indeed history. So schoolmasters, school teachers matter. And at their best, they change lives. And my life was certainly changed as a result of having been lucky enough, the sheer flukish good fortune to have been able to sit at his feet.
Interesting, isn't it? That one person who really just captured the imagination of the young David in Birmingham, because that's where you grew up, of course. So what was it like growing up in Birmingham?
That's another bit of the story, really, that Birmingham I grew up in, I was born in 1950. It turns out a very good year to have been born. And for my generation, I think we've lived through an era on the whole of peace and progress and prosperity and plenty, in a way those who came before us didn't, and it's not been so easy for many who've come since. But the Birmingham I grew up in was a very interesting place. In the 1950s, it was in many ways still Joseph Chamberlain's Birmingham, a wonderful ensemble of civic buildings in the middle, Mason College, the precursor of the university, the town hall, the council house, the Midland Institute, the reference library, where later on I worked. And that was a world where if you parachuted Joseph Chamberlain back into it, he would have recognized it all. And so I did grow up in what was still recognisably a Victorian city. But then in the 60s, the new Birmingham was the mode. Lots of the historic buildings, including the library and the Midland Institute, were knocked down. And in that decade, at the same time, the study of the 19th century became a serious academic enterprise, classically in Asa Briggs's Victorian cities, in which Birmingham gets a starring role. So it was terribly lucky to grow up in a Victorian city, which then began to disappear. But as it disappeared, the history of the 19th century became a much more serious subject. Now, of course, hundreds of thousands of people in Birmingham lived through that, my contemporaries, and I don't think any of the rest of them became historians. So one can't, as it were, over-explain it. But I haven't any doubt, as I look back on my earlier life, that those were very formative influences and experiences.
But I mean, in what way did your family influence your desire to go to university? Because you were the first in your family to go to university, indeed, quite a departure. I think your parents were both what could be described as minor civil servants. So this must have been a very exciting time, because not only did you go to university, but you went to Cambridge University, which, of course, you know, highly prestigious. And at that time when you went, it was still very largely dominated by the public school, you know, upper classes.
Well, yes, that's all, as it were, true. My parents were minor civil servants. I was the first member of my family to go to university. But again, I come back to the point about luck, really, of being born in 1950. I got a marvellous education at my primary school, where there was a head mistress, Mrs. Thurman, who was, as it were, Mrs. Thatcher before Mrs. Thatcher. Terrifying, intimidating, but in her own way, very extraordinary. And I wrote a bit about her, in fact, in the preface to my little life on Margaret Thatcher. So I got a marvellous education at a primary school. I got a marvellous education at a grammar school, all free, moreover. And then I won a place at Cambridge. And again, the rest is history. And that's my point about how lucky it was to belong to that generation, that these opportunities were available, freely available, granted not to everybody, but to some people, myself included. These were opportunities which had not been available for my parents. So I have always believed in the benefits and the virtue of access, of making opportunity available. I I've had many opportunities in my life that my parents didn't have, and I don't see why other people shouldn't have the opportunities that I had.
So, as you say, born in the right era, and you had some luck, but then, as they always say, luck favours the prepared mind, doesn't it? And boy, was your mind prepared, because you graduated from Cambridge with a double first. And in your early career, including your doctoral work, because you are truly Oxbridge, because after having got your double first at Cambridge, you then went to Oxford as a graduate student. But your work very much explored class and the aristocracy. So what is it that intrigued you about the British upper class?
Well, just back to Oxford and Cambridge first, if I may, and then we'll get on to the aristocracy. When I was at Cambridge, I was at Clare College, and the master then was a very remarkable man, Eric Ashby, Sir Eric Ashby, later Lord Ashby. And he was remarkable by the Cambridge standards of the time because he'd not been a Cambridge undergraduate or an Oxford undergraduate. He'd been at London. He'd gone to America as a Commonwealth Fund Fellow. He taught in Sydney, at Sydney University. Enoch Powell was one of his colleagues, then at Bristol, then at Queen's Belfast, where he was Vice-Chancellor before he came to Cambridge. So he'd seen a lot of the academic world. And when I beguiled or persuaded the examiners to be more generous to me in part one of the History Tripos than they probably should have been, he wrote me a note and he said, we must talk. And he said, well, David, you've done well, and maybe you want to become a professional historian, and that would be a good thing, but you must go away from here. You must go somewhere else. So I went to Oxford. Well, that wasn't very far away, but it was a very different world, and it was a wonderfully stimulating environment at St. John's College where I was. And he said, you must go to America. It will be a hugely liberating experience. It will broaden your mind, which certainly needs broadening. So Ashby was a great mentor. And in a sense, I just did exactly what he told me. I've spent most of my life doing what other people tell me, and it's worked out quite well. So I went to Oxford, and then I went to America. And we might talk a bit more about those in a minute.
We'll come back to America in a minute, but I just wondered, because it is quite interesting that, as you came from a family which hadn't been to university at all until it was you, and you were very sort of curious about the upper classes.
Yes, well, I mean, again, there's a kind of Birmingham articulation to that. The posh bit of Birmingham, where my family certainly did not live, was Edgbaston. An indication being it's where the cricket ground is, and on the whole, cricket grounds are in posh suburbs. Headingley will be another example, I suppose. And Edgbaston was owned by the Calthorpe family, who were an aristocratic family, but most of their money came from the ground rents of the urban development of Edgbaston in the 19th century. And it was impossible not to, as it were, notice all that as I was living in Birmingham. And it gave one a rather interesting take on the aristocracy, not about broad agricultural acres, but about involvement with the processes of urbanization, industrialization. And the curious relationship that gave the Calthorpe family with many of the nonconformist figures who were driving progress in Birmingham by the late 19th century, of whom, of course, Joseph Chamberlain was the most famous one. So this was a very atypical, or at least not representative, relationship between the aristocracy and the towns, the middle classes and the upper classes. And I thought that would be an interesting approach to aristocratic finance and business, and to some degree politics. So that in a way is how I got started off. And it did turn out to be a very fruitful and interesting field of inquiry.
Interesting. So as you said, you went to America on the advice of one of your mentors. So Cambridge, then Oxford, and then you go to the US to Princeton, where you still are now, of course. So how did going to the United States change your life? Did it really affect some kind of transformation in your thinking, in your trajectory as a historian? What impact did it have?
Well, it had a huge impact. I came to Princeton and to America for the first time in the autumn of 1973. And I flew on a VC-10. This dates things a lot. And I was wearing a very heavy tweed jacket and what were then known as cavalry twill trousers. And I arrive in America and the temperature is 90 degrees and the humidity 90% to 90% of the time. So I'm catastrophically inappropriately dressed. And my first encounter is Kennedy Airport, and then the New York subway, and then 42nd Street, at that point, the pornographic capital of the world, and the Port Authority bus terminal and the New Jersey Turnpike. And I did think to myself, is this a good idea? should I really be here? Anyway, I then arrived at Princeton, which is amazingly beautiful and is a wonderful university, and sort of fell in love with it. And it was a very mind-broadening experience. I took courses in sociology and statistics and various other subjects, econometrics, I think, which added extra kind of intellectual ballast, I suppose, if I could put it that way. It was also Watergate year. The Watergate scandal unfolded across that year, and I returned to Britain in July 73, and Nixon resigned very soon after, 74, and Nixon resigned very soon after. So America was putting on a fabulous kind of psycho-political drama while I was there, and that was hugely exciting. And I sat at the feet, in particular, of Lawrence Stone, a controversial historian who I greatly admired, and who himself worked on the aristocracy in the early modern period. And he became a friend and was, again, very good to me. So I found all that hugely broadening intellectually, socially. And at the end of my time, I went round on the train. I got a ticket which cost $120, and I took the train to Chicago, then down to New Orleans, then out to Los Angeles, then up to Seattle and back to Chicago. So I saw for the first time, the greatest skyscraper city of the 20th century, that's to say Chicago. I heard jazz in Preservation Hall in New Orleans. I saw the sunrise over the Grand Canyon and the sunset behind the Golden Gate Bridge, and that was kind of wonderful. So it was a hugely transforming and liberating experience in exactly the way that Eric Ashby had told me it would be.
Interesting. So, broadening your horizons, the jazz and all the rest of it, as you mentioned, but I mean, did it change you intellectually? I mean, was there an intellectual transformation? Or if I can put it this way, is there a difference in the way that history is taught and consumed, between the United States and the UK? Are there differences? And if so, what are they? And did you find it very enriching, clearly?
Well, I certainly got to know in more detail than I had before various aspects of the social sciences, in particular, I think sociology, some economics, some econometrics, and I found that very stimulating. I'd always slightly regretted I hadn't changed to economics at Cambridge and just stayed with history. So I kind of fulfilled that previously thwarted desire or mistaken decision. And that was very important. And I'd always been, I think, friendly towards the social sciences, which is one of the joys of having been president of the British Academy, because we do the humanities and the social sciences. I suppose it was very important to get a sense of the fact that the history of England or the history of Britain looks very different in a country that is not Britain or England. That the history of your own country is seen in a particular way. It's the history you most want to know about, arguably. Whereas the history of a foreign country, which is what British history in America was and is somehow different. And so that was also, in its own way, a kind of broadening experience, because one had to think about why should people in America be interested in British history? Because clearly they wouldn't be the same reasons that people in Britain were and are interested in British history. So those were, in their own senses, I think, transformative and hugely stimulating new perspectives to have obtained.
So did it make you feel that there are different perspectives of any particular history? As you said, if you're in the States looking at British history, it brings a different lens, and vice versa, and that's applied to in all sorts of ways, really, when we look at history today.
Yes, I think it made me realise that while history ultimately depends on such archival evidence as is available, and one has to hold close to that sense that there is some sort of truth that is knowable, nevertheless, the perspectives that people bring to bear on it are different, and it's from those different perspectives that enlightenment may dawn, progress may be made, controversy may be stirred up, sometimes for good, sometimes for ill. I mean, it seems to me, as it were, that I presume, though it's not my subject, that mathematics is probably the same in America as it is in Britain or in Australia. History is not the same.
Yeah.
And that was a lesson I learned.
Yeah, very interesting. The facts may be there, but the interpretation sometimes can become more nuanced, can't it?
Yes.
Let's look at some of your research in your books, because as I said, you've been a prolific writer. You've been the author as well as the editor of many, many books focusing on the period of British history, 1800 to 2000, 2 whole centuries to play with, David. So, and you've written books about people such as Margaret Thatcher, Winston Churchill, Anthony Blunt. I mean, quite often you do look at characters, individuals who might be seen as perhaps exciting controversy or being a bit divisive, if I can put it that way. So what kind of challenges do you encounter when you have to write about such subjects?
Well, it's certainly true that for a historian, I probably have written quite a lot of biographies, as distinct from histories, if I can put it that way. And I note with interest when I was thinking about this, that if one takes Andrew Mellon and Anthony Blunt and George V and G.M. Trevelyan, about whom I've written, none of these were men who would make a party go. And I wonder what I've done to end up writing about all these slightly taciturn and not wholly, as it were, agreeable social figures. But anyway, so be it. I enjoyed writing about them all. I think that biography is an interesting genre. I think historians do biography differently from those who are full-time biographers, because I think we have a broader sense of the context within which their lives are lived and the capacity they have to do things, but the constraints on their capacity to do things, because we understand the broader context. Frick famously says, and he and Mellon, of course, were great friends, there was important work to do, but if you and I hadn't done it, somebody else would have done it. And I think one does have that sense as a historian, that these lives have to be understood in some sense of perspective and proportion. But I mean, I love doing the Trevelyan book. I think he was a great historian and a great public figure. I enjoy doing the Thatcher book for the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, how to write about a very controversial figure in as even-handed a way as possible, and how to get her in a broader historical context. George V, well, enormous fun to do, a very interesting monarch, not a very, I think, bright man, but a very good king, and make of that what you will. Andrew Mellon, shy, strange, taciturn, odd, hopeless in judging women and love, infallible in judging men and business. The skills were not transferable, so the marriage was a disaster. And trying to work out the structure for the Mellon biography was particularly challenging. It was a very big life on a very large scale, with many themes to it: the family, the money, the bank, art collecting, politics, and how to compose a biography which had many strands to it, but to drive them all forward without it collapsing into total incoherence. So I repeat, I don't think any of them were meant to make a party go, but they were all enormously fun and challenging and interesting to write about.
It's a bit like asking a parent, who their favourite child is. And I know it's a slightly predictable question, but would you want to stick your neck out if I asked you which is your favourite book?
Well, I looked at my resume this morning in preparation for this interview to remind myself of the books that I've written, because you sort of tend to forget if you're not careful, or, they just seem to be written by someone who has the same name as yourself.
Like many, I suppose.
Anyway, yeah. So, I mean, the obvious and rather, I suppose, predictable answer is my favourite book is the one that I'm writing now, because one always lives in hope that it'll be better than the previous books. This never quite happens, but, it's an aspiration to try to encourage. And so the current book is the history of the Ford Foundation, which carries with it a whole set of its own expositional problems, but I'm enormously enjoying it, and I'm fretting about how to get the structure right, but that's part of the business. I mean, I suppose I do have a particularly soft spot for the Trevelyan book, which kind of wrote itself. I do think he was a remarkable figure. The books are extraordinary and the letters are amazing. I mean, he just knew everybody. There's a marvellous letter he writes when Bertrand Russell, who they were both at Trinity College, Cambridge together, they were both apostles, they knew each other well. And when Bertrand Russell gets the OM, which Trevelyan has had a long time before, Trevelyan writes in this wonderful letter, which essentially says, "Dear Bertie, welcome aboard, hope you're okay, yours ever, George." And I mean, at one level, I think that must have made people like that rather insufferable. But what was admirable about Trevelyan was, I don't think, as I say, he would have been an interesting figure he had no small talk. If he had nothing to say, he just didn't say anything. But he was immensely public spirited. He regarded writing history for a broad audience as a public duty and obligation. And he did a huge amount of public work as well for the British Museum, the National Portrait Gallery, and above all, the National Trust. And here was a man born to an immensely privileged background who could simply have idled the time away. But he worked incredibly hard, and I admired him for that.
Well, you've got a lot in common with George Trevelyan, historian, strong work ethic and, public service ethos and so on. But you do have very excellent small talk. So the comparison doesn't extend
Well, I can neither confirm nor deny that. But of course, what was also interesting about Trevelyan was that he was born into and inhabited an utterly different world from the world that I was born into and inhabited, and trying to sort out the networks, the connections, to understand, again, the context within which his life and work took place was hugely interesting.
Yeah, well, yes, good. No, having spent a lot of social occasions with you, you are one of the most entertaining dinner guests somebody could wish to sit beside. Well. So, all right, so as I said at the beginning, alongside your extensive academic career, David, as we were just saying, you've got a very strong sense of serving the public, and you've really, you know, been on the boards of so many of the UK's great institutions, you know, obviously the British Academy now as president, but, you know, the Royal Academy, English Heritage, Historic Royal Palaces, you know, just to name a few. But, you know, you must really be a little bit worried about how these great institutions have been affected by the pandemic. So just give us an idea of how you think they're going to recover, because I mean, in some cases, like historic royal palaces, you know, they rely so much on their revenue from visitors and so on, and you know, English heritage and so on. So what are your reflections? How do you think they'll cope with this turbulence?
Well, since that's a two-part question, can I take the two parts? I mean, it is true indeed that I've gone about quite a bit in great cultural institutions, and I've enormously enjoyed that. I've always been very careful only to do things where it would seem that a historian is somebody they want, and if they're desperate, they might even want me. And so that's, in a way, how that's happened. It's also the case that when I ceased to run the Institute of Historical Research in London, I was financed by the Mellon Foundation and John Sainsbury to spend 5 years, as it were, putting myself about doing this sort of thing. And so I duly did. But another aspect of this, and again, its context is everything, is that, of course, what had changed about these cultural boards from the late 1990s on was the advent of the implementation of the Nolan rules, which meant you could only serve 2 terms. And before that, people had stayed on these boards forever. When I wrote the history of the National Portrait Gallery, you know, 30 years you'd barely limbered up. People were on for 40 years, 2 of them were on for 50 years. And Nolan rules opened up that world to people like me and people like you. And I remember when I was being looked over to sit on the Royal Mint Committee, somebody said to me, he said, well, you know, in the old days, it was frightfully grand. You know, the Duke of Edinburgh chaired it and Kenneth Clarke was on it, but it's now gone so down market sociologically, even you might stand a chance of getting on. So that was sort of that. And so, again, it was an amazing piece of luck to be in the right place at the right time, and I can claim really no credit for that. The business about how COVID has affected things, well, it's certainly true if I think of 3 of the institutions with which I've been lucky enough to be connected: Westminster Abbey, historic royal palaces that we both sat on, and the Royal Academy. They were, and still are, almost entirely dependent on visitor income. And in an earlier time, that seemed a good idea, that they weren't constrained by the conditions that came with government funding. But now it doesn't seem such a good idea, because tourism is not what it was. Who knows when international tourism will come back? And of course, it's the international tourists who are so important for Westminster Abbey and historic royal palaces in particular. So it may turn out that that funding model, being independent of government money, but dependent on visitor revenue, it may turn out that that model, which seems such a good idea pre-COVID, may not necessarily be such a good idea going forward. And I think that's still a matter to be, you know, discussed and worked through.
Yeah, it's being played out, isn't it? I mean, so that you've got COVID, but I just want to flesh this out a bit more, because when you became president of the British Academy 4 years ago, I remember you saying at the time that, you know, Brexit is going to mean a great many things for the Academy, as you put it, and many of which, of course, we didn't know at the time. So fast forwarding, what, you know, 4 years later, what you know now, what challenges do you think Brexit did bring? the British Academy's way?
Well, it certainly turned out that, and here perhaps the luck wasn't quite as flowing as well as in earlier times in my life. I have ended up as the Brexit president and the COVID president and the virtual president. But, if you're a historian, you can't complain about events. If there were no events, there wouldn't be much history and we'd all be out of business. So, you can't really choose what the events are at the time that you're around. Brexit produced a huge amount of extra work for some of the fellows and many of the staff at the Academy. A huge array of unrelenting government meetings in the first 2 years of my presidency, because the British government was focused almost exclusively on that, and therefore the British Academy was much involved because of the associations with Europe and the European research funding, from which in fact historically Britain had done very well. We got more money out than we put in, and of the disproportionate amount of money we got out, the humanities and social sciences did extremely well. So we were very eager to ensure, and in fairness, so were the other national academies, that association with what's called Horizon Europe would continue. And in the end, it has continued, though the terms are still not fully worked out. So that created a huge amount of extra work for many fellows and for the staff. We now also live in a world where in the old days, spending reviews happened once every 4 years and you got a settlement and you just chugged along until the next time round. Now spending reviews happen every year. And that's a huge amount of extra work. And then, of course, there's COVID. And many fellows at the Academy, especially in the social sciences, but also in history, have been involved in a large amount of government work, and we produced 2 enormously important reports on COVID, which are doing the rounds in Whitehall, and which are making the point that the health of society is a medical matter, but it's also much more than a medical matter. And if we are to build back better and level up, then fixing broken communities, broken lives, broken economies is going to be a big job, and you can't do that without the humanities and social sciences. So while I'm not sure ideally I would have chosen these 4 years to be president, it has beyond any question been hugely interesting, and it certainly reaffirmed my belief that the humanities and social sciences are deeply publicly significant. And I think we've shown by example of the work that we've done that that's true.
Well, that may be true, but let's just drill down a little bit more on this then, David, because you say, fixing broken societies and the role of the social sciences is a very, very important one. But, now the talk, trying to build back better after COVID, it's all, science and vaccines and, scientists are trotted out by, every minute, every day, every week. And it's all about STEM and, and all the rest of it. So how can you make the case for the social sciences? Because I know the Academy has been very much involved in a new initiative called SHAPE, which is social sciences, humanities, and the arts for people and the economy. And you expressed your hope that this term, as it were, is going to reach, the public conscious as much as STEM. But how are you going to manage that and, make the case?
Well, it is a very good question. And I ought to say that this initiative about SHAPE is very much one that my successor as president, Julia Black, is associated with. And she has worked really hard on that and will, I think, push it further forward. I think it is largely a matter of as it were, showing and telling and pointing out back to the COVID report that we've done, that if you want to build back better and you want to fix broken lives and broken communities and broken economies, medicine may help you fix the epidemic, but it won't help you fix the behavioral consequences. And I think changing patterns of human behavior, understanding patterns of human behavior is absolutely crucial if we are in fact to progress further. And in fairness, I would want to say that the Chief Scientific Advisor, Sir Patrick Vallance, is very much aware of this set of issues. And he is the co-chair of the Council for Science and Technology. And it was he who commissioned the Academy to do these reports. And I think he fully understands that the social economic aspects of dealing with, for example, the consequences of COVID aren't the same as it were, the scientific aspects of curing the illness. And I think we have made a lot of progress on that, and I'm sure that we shall continue to do so. I mean, another example of this, since I do think it's arguing by example, the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, your continent and your world much more than mine, but it soon transpired with the Ebola outbreak that it was indeed a medical problem, but the transmission was to do with the very strange burial practices in, I think, Sierra Leone. And so we sent out some anthropologists who could actually help us understand that. And that played a major part, along with the medical treatment, in, as it were, attenuating that disease. So we may need to blow our trumpet more, but we have a lot of evidence of where serious work has been done, which really does improve the health of society by people working in our disciplines. And I think the Academy has made a lot of progress on that over the last 4 years. And I'm sure under my successor, it will do more of that.
Mm. So these links and the interface between science and the arts and the social sciences, you clearly make a very, persuasive case for that. And it's one which, as you say, increasingly people are buying into. But your particular subject, history, do you think that the recent events, what we've seen with the pandemic and COVID and all the rest of it, maybe has changed the role of history in public life?
Well, I think it's certainly true that a variety of people, for instance, Simon Sharma or Margaret Macmillan or Paul Slack, all of them fellows of the Academy, have written on earlier pandemics and what conclusions might be drawn from a study of these earlier pandemics, in terms of the fact that pandemics almost always point up fissures, injustices in societies. The poor always suffer most in pandemics. And also the ways in which people can be scapegoated as the vectors of whatever virus or disease it might be. And I think there are a lot of historical precedents from which we can learn about where we are at the moment. And I think there are, from those precedents, lessons can be learned about how to go forward, that we do need to remember that it's the poor who suffer most in pandemics. We do need to remember that outsiders can be scapegoated because they're thought to be the people who brought the virus. Donald Trump's claim it was a Chinese virus. That there are a set of issues like that that we need to be very sensitive to and aware of as we try to move forward.
Yeah. So, you've been a huge advocate of this kind of topic, and you gave a talk at one of the British Academy's 10-minute talks in June last month, and you said that you believe that the president of the British Academy should be a champion, advocate, defender, as it were, of the humanities and social sciences in the way that you've been outlining. So Professor Julia Black steps into your shoes at the end of this week. So what do you want to see her do? What are your words of advice to her?
Well, I don't need any word to give her any advice. I mean, she's very bright, she's very clever, she's very wonderful. I'm a huge fan. I'm looking forward to her presidency even more enthusiastically, I think, than I look forward to my own. She's a very, very accomplished lawyer. She's interested in innovation, regulation. She's astonishingly well networked across a whole range of areas, from the Bank of England to UKRI to the National Audit Office. I think that, and she's very strongly for the SHAPE initiative. I think she will continue to raise the profile of the Academy. I think she will argue very impressively for the importance of our subjects. And I think she will do an absolutely brilliant job. And actually, I can't wait for her to get started.
Very good. Well, I hope she's listening. Listen, we're getting some questions in. So I've got a couple more I'd like to ask you, but let's just take something from the people joining us in this on this event. So Paola asks if you could tell us one thing that makes you hopeful and one thing that makes you fearful about the health of our disciplines in this climate of disparagement of humanities and social sciences, is how Paola sees it. Disparagement of humanities and social sciences in this climate, she says. So what makes you hopeful and fearful, she asks?
Well, what makes me hopeful is that there are a very large number of very brilliant and brave practitioners of the humanities and social sciences, and people of all ages. I think in particular our early career research network at the Academy, there are lots of very bright and brave and brilliant young people in the humanities and social sciences. Very clever, doing very interesting work, some of it, not all of it, but some of it with, I think, considerable public potential in terms of helping us with our current difficulties. All of that, I think, makes me greatly hopeful for the future. And when you've reached the age and stage that I have, it's thinking about the people who come after you, especially the young people who come after you, that becomes, and I think very properly becomes, an important subject of concern. So I think I have great hope about that. Right. Fearful? Well, I suppose the disparagement of expertise, the disparagement of the social sciences and the humanities in particular, but I think disparagement, certainly having lived through 4 years of Donald Trump, of any form of expertise is, I think, deeply worrying. I think the growth in nationalism, nativism, xenophobia, which is in part, I think, connected to the downturn of 2008 and in part connected to COVID, is worrying. The last time there was lots of nativism and nationalism and xenophobia in the 1930s, it did not end well. Well, I hope we're not there, and I don't believe we are. History doesn't ever repeat itself. But those are causes for serious concern. And I don't envy people much younger than me thinking about how they're going to be living out their lives 30, 40, 50 years from now. Not least, of course, because to add into the mix, we have global warming, and that's clearly not a problem that's going away anytime soon. So I think, I'm an incorrigible optimist. And I think that as long as there are bright people, sooner or later they will win out for public benefit, notwithstanding the fact that we live in a sinful world. And I hope that will continue, that balance will continue to come out the right way.
Very interesting answer. If I may just pick up on something you've just said, you said history never repeats itself. Is that the case? Is that what you think?
Well, I hope so. Otherwise, half of us would be out of business. So, it's rather important it doesn't repeat itself, because then the number of books we'd need to be rather less than those that we do. I don't think it ever absolutely repeats itself. Of course, it's Marx, I think, who said it repeats itself first time as tragedy and second time as farce. Where exactly the Donald Trump presidency fits into that cycle, I don't think any of us are yet sure. I don't think it absolutely repeats itself. And it's important to notice that, there's enough history around, or there has been enough history, that you can find an example to support almost anything that anybody wants to do now. So one does have to be very careful in working out what, if any, are the lessons of the past. But no, I don't think it absolutely repeats itself. And for reasons I've just given, I'm very glad it doesn't. Otherwise, I'd be out of a job.
So we've got another question here. You've told us that your Trevelyan book was your favourite one, but this is related a bit to that, but somewhat different. You've written about a range of figures from history. Who among the people you've written about has intrigued you the most? And there's a follow-up question, but let's deal with that one first.
That's a very good question.
That is an interesting one, yes.
Yes, it's an intriguing question about being intrigued, I suppose. One of my many illustrious predecessors as president of the Academy, Gary Runciman, who died earlier this year and who was a very, very brilliant sociologist and much more than that, he always said that when writing about past episodes or past people, you should approach them with a combination of sympathy and detachment. That's to say, you should take it for granted that they're more important than you are because you're writing about them, whereas they would never write about you. So you need to, as it were, give them as fair a hearing as you can. But you must also regard them with a certain amount of detachment. That's to say, you shouldn't necessarily take them entirely at their own self-evaluation. And I think, so as it were, it's the warm heart and the cold eye. And I think that's a good base from which to try to work things out. Now, by whom have I been most intrigued, which is maybe being intrigued is something to do with both sympathy and detachment. I did find Andrew Mellon an extraordinarily intriguing figure. He was a terribly boring man, but he lived an amazingly interesting life. And I was intrigued by that apparent paradox. How could this man, who was really very socially maladroit and hopeless at making speeches, and certainly not a man to make a party go and had no small talk, and was hopeless about love and women, but was simply brilliant about men and business. I'd never encountered anybody quite so strange as him, I suppose. And I was intrigued by that, and trying to render him historically credible and trying to give him a fair hearing was difficult in part because his politics weren't mine. He and Roosevelt didn't get on, and I suppose I'd like to think I'd have voted for Roosevelt in the 1930s. So politically, we were not kindred spirits. And I mean, I don't think our personalities were quite aligned either, as it were. And so I found the attempt to understand him a challenge, because I was intrigued that he was a very strange man.
But laid the bedrock of philanthropy and how, you know, huge philanthropist, which...
Yes, it was a remarkable life because, I mean, he made a ton of money and he was an exceptionally creative entrepreneur, a venture capitalist, I mean, one of the major agents of the economic transformation of Western Pennsylvania in the late 19th and late 20th century. But he became a great art collector, and he gave all his great art to set up the National Gallery in Washington. And I think there was some slight sense he had in the end that in order to, as it were, redeem himself and his life, he would make this extraordinary benefaction to the American people, which indeed it was, and indeed to this day remains.
Okay, well, the follow-up I'm going to keep for later because it relates to something I wanted to ask you. But we've had another question here. Thanking you very much for this conversation, first of all. And Dilara Art says, in the 1980s, you expressed concern about the academic approach to the history of death and grief. Has this changed, she asks, and what would you say is still needed?
Well, gosh, that's a rather serious question. I wrote a piece called War and Death, Grief and Mourning in Modern Britain.
Yeah.
Back in the 1980s. So it's a rather venerable piece now, and I can't pretend to have reread it recently, so I'm not fully up with what I then thought or wrote, but I was playing with the idea that the claim that the 20th century denied death, which had been one that Philippe Ariès, who had written a very influential book on death, put forward, seemed to me to be rather difficult to sustain in the era of the millions who died in the First and the Second World War and the Holocaust. And I wrote in particular about the cenotaph and the cult of Remembrance Day and imperial war graves, and how these were all attempts, in fact, to come to terms with death and grief, especially of those who had died too young. And that a large part of what was going on in the cultural and public life of Britain after 1918 was concerned to try to help people come to terms with that. And in fact, I revisited that recently when I wrote the history of the Westminster Abbey in the 20th century for the volume that I edited, because of course the Unknown Warrior was buried there and became a huge focus for people to go and visit. So I think that that early piece helped to put on the map, on the scholarly map, an attempt to think about death in the 20th century and death in war and commemoration and memory. It put onto the scholarly map that set of issues, which other people, I think, since then have taken forward in far more sophisticated ways than I did. But I think it did open up a subject a bit, and I'm glad that other people followed it up and ran with it in a very exciting way.
Perhaps you should revisit it, David. Yeah.
Yes, perhaps I should revisit it. I mean, I've written quite a few pieces that have sort of opened up project topics. I mean, the piece on the British monarchy and the invention of tradition did the same, and I rather like doing things like that, as well as writing these large-scale.
Yeah, it's very important to open up the discourse and so on. So a question here from Paul Dolan. Have you radically changed your opinion about a historical figure as a result of your own research or over the course of your career? You said at the outset you're quite even-handed in the way you approach your research and your books, but have you changed your opinion radically, is the question.
Well, it is, again, a very good question. I mean, I think I changed my opinion about Mellon. I wasn't especially drawn to him in the first instance in terms of the fact that, as I've said, our politics were different and he wasn't a person whose temperament I warmed to. But I did come to see that though a strange and shy and difficult man, it had been a major life, even if there were skeletons in his closet. and that he did achieve a sort of belated form of redemption and perhaps atonement and nobility. And I certainly changed my mind about that as I got to know him better. And I was quite sorry when I had to kill him off in the end. I mean, I was with him a long time, and I sort of missed him. So I certainly changed my opinion over him. Thatcher, I think, was a very interesting challenge to do. I wrote this because it was, in fact, it started out as the entry I wrote on her for the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, of which I'm editor. And I was told by the research editors, well, normally, the editor gets to write the life of the monarch, but the Queen's going to outlive you, so you can't do that. So go for Thatcher instead as sort of proximea cessit. So I did Thatcher. And it was very interesting to try to write about someone who I could remember in her prime and whom I had lived through the 1980s. And it was very interesting to revisit the 1980s as a historian, as distinct from a sort of very low-level participant. Did I change my views of her much? I think I came to admire her courage and her energy and her patriotism more. I mean, I think she was very controversial, but she was a very, very extraordinary figure. And that last speech she gave in Parliament after the cabinet had told her she had to go and Labour proposed a no confidence motion, I think as a display of parliamentary courage was absolutely astonishing. So, I mean, I have to confess, although I think in some ways she did damage, in other ways she was probably necessary, and it was hard not to admire her in some ways.
Right, interesting, good. Caroline wants to take us back to your family. And asks if you have any siblings. I know you have an older sister, but she asks, were you able to take your parents with you as your life moved out of their world, her words, as Alan Bennett was unable to do? So there you go, make what you want of that one.
Yes, well, that again is a very good question. Well, I think that they wanted for me and my sister the things that they'd not had. Of which a university education was certainly the crucial ingredient. I think that the fact that we both did well at university gave them immense pleasure. Whether they fully understood, what I spent my time doing, I don't know. I mean, they didn't say this, but other relatives did. They kept saying, well, of course, you have these terribly long holidays, don't you? And one tried to explain that actually I was researching and writing books and that this wasn't a holiday at all, but I never could quite get them, not my parents, but other relatives to see that. And I think that is a very interesting question about how, if you're on as it were, an upward career trajectory, of a kind that's very different from your parents or other members of your family, that does create certain, how shall I put it, challenges and problems. Yes, I mean, I think it's a well-posed question.
Yes, yes. I know your sister was older than you. You mentioned she went to university, but she went as a mature student.
That's right, yes, she went after me.
The first member of your family to go to university. So I think that's all we have time for on the questions. I think I've gone through all the questions that we've received so far. So I want to go back to something I wanted to ask you, which is, you've said you intend to write the history of the Academy, which is going to keep you very occupied, I'm sure. But do you have any other projects on the horizon? And that was one of the questions that we had as well here, which is, it's related to that. So tell us first of all about your projects, and then I'll tell you what was asked about the future here.
Well, yes, I mean, I'm being asked to write the history of the British Academy, and I think it will be a subject I want to engage with. It's a complicated subject in all sorts of ways, but it needs doing. I mean, I'm anxious to say it won't culminate in my presidency. That wouldn't be the purpose of writing it, and I think we'd stop before that. But I mean, yes, I've got lots of other books. I want to write a history of monarchies in the 19th, 20th century. I want to write a book on Churchill and the special relationship, which still seems to me not to have been done properly. I want to write a book on composers and what composers said about music as distinct from composing things. I want to write a book on Churchill and Gladstone and late style in politics, which I think it will be enormous fun to do. But the problem is, you can't write a serious history book in under 5 years and probably nearer to 10. So that's, 4 books and that's 30 years. Well, I'll be 90 by then. So, the likelihood of this is not high. The actuarial numbers don't add up. But I think And I hope, depending on states of health, that it will be possible to keep working. If I look at the titans of my profession in America, say Peter Gay or Bernard Bailyn, or in this country, happily still with us, John Eliot and Keith Thomas and Quentin Skinner, they keep working, they keep writing, they want to keep finding out more about the past. And I very much hope that I'll be able to do so. But I think the likelihood, I mean, that's a long list of unfinished books or unbegun books. On the other hand, Hugh Trevor Roper published more books after he was dead than when he was alive. So maybe there's hope for us all yet.
So look, somebody here is saying your interests are so wide ranging. How do you land on your next focus? So how do you decide what you're next going to do?
Well, it's often serendipity, and it's often reactive rather than proactive. I mean, I never expected to write The Life of Andrew Mellon. You know, the phone rang in Norfolk one summer when I was still teaching at Columbia, and before I could say who I was, somebody said, "This is the Andrew Mellon Foundation in New York. We want you to write The Life of Andrew Mellon." And I said, "This is David Cannadine in Norfolk, England. You must have the wrong number." And to this day, I still think there's some thwarted writer in New York, you know, waiting for the phone to ring. So that was an entirely reactive decision, and it took me into a whole world of philanthropy and museums and art and galleries, which I never expected to get into. The Aristocracy book I did want to write. Trevelyan I was asked to write, but was delighted to write. The Undivided Past I very much wanted to write. Ford Foundation I wanted to write, but it was also, in a sense, a commission. So there's never been a game plan, really. I mean, my life has been very unplanned, and and that's true of the books too, really.
Yeah. So that's how you land on your next focus. Robert asks, after such a distinguished transatlantic life, where are you most at ease? Where is home?
Oh, well, I mean, there's only one possible answer to that. Home is where Linda is. That's the only possible.
Oh, Linda Colley, your wonderful wife, fellow historian.
Yeah, that's the only possible answer.
Well, she's with you at Princeton, I know, and then you also have a home here in Norfolk in England and in London. So wherever you're travelling between those with Linda.
There is a bit of toing and froing, although, of course, it's been much reduced in this last 18 months. I mean, for me, as indeed for people like you.
Yeah. Good. So, all right, I think we just a final question really to you. I'm afraid that's all we have time for on the Q&As. But look, as your term as president of the British Academy ends at the end of this week, just give us perhaps some final broader reflections, David, please, on your life and career. And, you know, you've got 3 or 4 minutes to do that, if you like.
Well, it's certainly true that when you reach the age that I've now reached, which is 70, and I still like to think I'm in my late 20s and full of youth and ardour and hope and ambition, but of course the numbers don't add up, that you begin to see your life as a period of historic time. I think, you know, historians tend to think in those terms. And history is about perspective and proportion, and I suppose we need to try to get ourselves in perspective and proportion. One thought is the extraordinary good luck of being born in 1950 and getting a marvellous education at state schools and at Cambridge, which cost my parents nothing, and getting to university at all, and especially Cambridge, and that just transformed the possibilities of my life, as of many other people too. And to live across a period, at least in large parts of Western Europe, though not elsewhere, of peace and plenty and prosperity and progress, more and more universities, more and more students. That has been an amazing piece of good fortune, which I share with my contemporaries. And it would be both unappreciative and ungrateful not to recognise that. So that's the broader context. The specifics are that next year, in the summer of 2022, it will be 50 years since I graduated from Cambridge. So the Golden Jubilee is coming up. And across what will then be those 50 years, I have been able to persuade and beguile 5 of the greatest universities in the world on both sides of the Atlantic to pay me money generously, to indulge my intellectual curiosity, to research, to write books, to meet marvellously clever undergraduates who have gone on and become important figures in a whole range of professions, to train wonderful graduate students, of whom the same is true, and to meet amazingly clever academics, not just in my own subject, but in many other subjects, from young people full of promise and ardour and hope and ambition, as I once was, to grand senior figures. And that's been the most extraordinarily privileged existence. certainly one to which I was not born, but it all happened, and I'd ended up as president of the British Academy. I just can't believe my luck, and I hope it holds a bit longer.
Well, David, I must say that, you say it was this person who inspired you and that, but you are really such an inspiring, towering intellect, and you have really, stimulated so many young minds to go on and do great things. I have 4 children, and one of them studied history at Cambridge and then learned that, I knew you, and it was as though his jaw dropped and hit the ground that, I knew this great historian, because you really are one of our preeminent thinkers. You are a thought leader through your broadcast work, and you've got that incredible ability to communicate, because it's no use just knowing everything and then not being able to communicate it properly. And that's what you do in such an engaging, accessible manner that really we are all privileged, those of us who are lucky to know you. And, we salute you. And it's been my great pleasure and privilege to have been in this conversation with you, Professor Sir David Cannadine. Thank you to you, all of you who've sent your questions in. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of them. And thank you to all of you listening to this terrific event from the British Academy, marking the last public event of Professor Sir David Cannadine. And I'm sure everybody joins me in wishing you all the best in your future endeavours, and don't stop writing. And love to Linda.
Thank you so much. That's very kind of you.
Thank you. Bye-bye, David. Thank you.